And we are live. Welcome everybody back to Sigmar Academy World History 1900 to present. So in this lecture we will be looking at the Woodrow Wilson presidency. I said in the very first lecture that I'm not a huge fan of Wilson, and I hope to make the case for why that is today. So, if we look at our overview, the Wilson presidency was an unmitigated disaster not just for America, but for the entirety of the Western world. Although Wilson implemented some based policies, these are drastically overshadowed by his negative policy decisions. For the right, the Wilson presidency marks a shambolic turn for the worse in American history. And here you can see on the left is a picture of Woodrow Wilson, and on the right, there he is with other Entente leaders in France. So if we move on to the next slide, why do both the left and right loathe Wilson? Woodrow Wilson is hated by both the left and the right. So if we look on the left, we can see why the left dislikes Wilson. Starting in 1913, Woodrow Wilson began segregating the federal government, based. Starting in 1914, Woodrow Wilson commissioned the construction of Confederate memorials, based. And in 1915, Wilson screened The Birth of the Nation in the White House. So these are the reasons why the left will bash on Wilson in the modern day. Basically, their main complaint about Wilson is that he's racist, and so ergo, they don't like him. However, these are probably the only base things Wilson did, and the rest of his presidency actually benefited the left and was a disaster for the right. So it really shows that the left doesn't have a good grasp on history when they attack Wilson. So going over to the right side and seeing why the right dislikes Wilson, in 1913, Wilson signed off on the creation of the Federal Reserve. In 1916, Wilson nominated Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. In 1917 through 1918, Wilson signed off on the Espionage and Sedition Acts, imprisoned ethnic Germans, and involved America in World War I on the behest of Wall Street. We will get into that in a future slide. And then there's also the matter of the 19th Amendment. Now, presidents do not play a formal role in the ratification of amendments. However, Wilson did lend his voice to supporting the 19th Amendment. So that's why the right doesn't like Wilson when it comes to the 19th Amendment. Even though he did not play a formal role in the ratification of it, he did lend his support to it and influenced some Southern Democrats in Congress who otherwise might not have supported it. So, if we proceed to the next slide, Wilson and the Federal Reserve. In our previous lecture, we studied the origins of the Federal Reserve System. In 1913, Wilson signed into law the Federal Reserve Act. So I did talk about this in the last lecture, but since it has such disastrous consequences and it happened during Wilson's watch, let's recap. The Federal Reserve System is a privately owned central banking system that dictates monetary policy within the United States. After 1913, the U.S. no longer printed its own currency. Instead, a network of private banks print U.S. dollars on behalf of the government and then loan them to the government on interest. Additionally, the 1913 Act included in the legislation that no stocks of the banks involved could be bought or sold on any stock exchange in the world. As a result, the original stockholders of the Federal Reserve banks never needed to fear losing their racket. And the prominent stockholders included members of the Rothschild, Warburg, and Schiff families. We discussed this much more in our previous lecture, but this is just a simple overview, and Woodrow Wilson is the president who signed it into law. So if we move on to the next slide. On the impotence of populism. A central banking system, especially one run by Jewish bankers, was not a popular idea among the American people. However, the legislation was expedited through Congress and signed into law on December 23rd, a day before Christmas Eve. Most lawmakers had returned home for the holiday and were not present in Washington to vote no on the legislation. So, longtime viewers of the channel will know that here at the Sigmar Academy, we are not populist, we believe in elite theory. We do not believe that simply having a majority of people agree with you guarantees that you'll be successful. You need to have elite backing, and you need to have power, most of all. So, Wilson had power. He did not have popular support on this particular issue, but that didn't matter, because once most of Congress had gone home for Christmas Eve, the legislation was expedited through Congress and he signed it into law 2 days before Christmas. The congressmen weren't present in Washington to be able to vote no. So this is just one example of why populism doesn't work and how elite theory is a more accurate understanding of power. And it also just shows that Wilson didn't really care about popular opinion. He was hell-bent on getting the Federal Reserve Act passed. So if we move on to the next slide. Subversive Associates of Wilson. Subversive actors had outsized influence on the president. This would lead to disastrous consequences, something which Wilson himself would eventually recognize, albeit too late. Examples of subversive agents in the Wilson administration are manifold. However, 3 of the worst people to influence the president included Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was a finance capitalist, representative of Wall Street within Wilson's cabinet, and associate of J.P. Morgan. House was instrumental in involving the U.S. in World War I. Bernard Baruch, a wealthy stockbroker who chaired the War Industries Board and managed the U.S.'s economic mobilization for World War I. And Louis Brandeis, who was Wilson's nominee for Supreme Court. He was the son of Frankist parents, a strident Zionist, and consistently shifted the Supreme Court leftward. So just going through all 3 of these characters, Colonel Edward House, I believe, was from Texas, but he worked his way up through Wall Street and was an associate of J.P. Morgan. And we're getting ahead of ourselves, but Morgan was basically bankrolling the British war effort in World War I. He was promised that a Central Powers defeat would happen within the first year of the war. That did not happen, and by 1917, it looked clear that the Kaiserreich had Britain and France on the ropes. So J.P. Morgan didn't want to lose his investment, he was irate, and he phoned Edward House and demanded that House get the U.S. involved. So House would go to President Wilson and say, you can sell this however you want. You can say that it's because of the Lusitania, which had happened 2 years prior, or you can say that it's because of the Zimmerman telegram, but the Central Powers are not going to win this war. And Wilson capitulated, and that's how the U.S. entered World War I. And we will discuss this more, not just on a future slide, but in its own lecture entirety, because it is a sad story that deserves much more detail than I'm currently giving it. The second person involved, Bernard Baruch, was a wealthy Jewish stockbroker who chaired the War Industries Board, and he was the guy really responsible for managing the economy of the U.S. during World War I. He was also a strident Zionist, as we discussed in one of the previous lectures. And the third guy, Louis Brandeis, was Wilson's nominee for Supreme Court. He was the son of Frankist parents, and if you don't know what Frankism is, it's basically an interpretation of Judaism which says that one should transgress all norms and revel in doing taboo things. I can make a whole video on Frankism itself, but suffice it to say it was very subversive and disgusting. And Brandeis would be responsible for shifting the Supreme Court in a leftward direction going into the 1920s and the 1930s. One example of this was in the Whitney versus California case, where Brandeis sided with communists who wanted to overthrow the U.S. government and said we have to protect their free speech to advocate the destruction of the U.S. government. So, not a good guy. And if we go on to the next slide. Okay, here's a quote from Wilson showing that he did eventually regret his decision to create the Federal Reserve and surround himself with subversive actors, but it was far too late. So Wilson says, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion. No longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." Woodrow Wilson in 1919. So, thanks Wilson. I'm glad you recognized this, but it's a bit too late. You really screwed us over. So, if we go on to the next slide. The election of 1916. In the middle of Wilson's presidency, as well as in the middle of World War I, the United States has an election. In the 1916 election, Woodrow Wilson defeats Charles Hughes 277 to 254. Wilson runs on a platform of keeping the U.S. out of the war, which he would go back on when Colonel House demands the U.S. intervene to protect Morgan and Wall Street's investment. So Wilson literally runs as the peace candidate and the isolation candidate, and that's why he's so popular, even though he doesn't win the election by a large margin. If Ohio had flipped, then Hughes would have won the election, but this does not happen. Wilson carries the solid South, much of the Midwest states, California as well as Washington. He also gets New Hampshire and, most importantly, Ohio. A Republican has never won the White House without winning Ohio, and that really dooms Charles Hughes in this election. Charles Hughes is a moderate Republican. He's seen as very limp-wristed by the public, but he carries the Northeast with the exception of New Hampshire. He carries Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, and if he had won Ohio, then he would have taken over as president. So if we go on to the next slide. Now we're getting into America's entry into World War I. So, at the onset of the war, Britain promised that the war would be a quick affair that would culminate in a complete Entente victory. The UK war effort was financed in no small part by J.P. Morgan, who lent vast amounts of unsecured credit to the British government. However, by 1917, the German Empire was poised to march on Paris. Morgan, irate and unwilling to see his investment go to waste, called Colonel House and demanded that America enter the war. House told Wilson that his Wall Street backers would not tolerate a German victory. Giving in to the pressure, Wilson made a speech to Congress asking for a declaration of war. Although bailing out Wall Street's investment was the true cause for American intervention, the declaration of war was pinned on the Zimmerman telegram and the sinking of the Lusitania, which served as a casus belli for war against the Kaiser. And this will be elaborated on in greater detail in a future lecture, but the war was mainly pinned on the Zimmerman telegram, which is not remembered correctly by high school history teachers as well as armchair historians. So the Zimmerman telegram, during World War I, Mexico and the United States were in a low-intensity war. Around the time Wilson got elected to office, Mexico was having its own revolution, and there was a lot of fighting going on within Mexico among the Mexicans, and some of that fighting spilled over into the United States. General Pershing himself was sent to capture the bandit Pancho Villa, who had launched excursion raids into American towns, and the Germans sent a telegram to the Mexicans saying, "We don't want the U.S. to intervene in the war, but if the U.S. does join the Entente and Mexico intervenes on the side of the Central Powers, Germany would send financial support as well as weapons to the Mexicans." The Zimmerman telegram was intercepted by the American government, and it made Americans irate. It did not immediately cause America to join the war. It would be pinned as the cause, but it was not the true cause. And then you also have the Lusitania, which sunk, I believe, 2 years prior to the American entry into the war. The Lusitania was a civilian ocean liner which was carrying weapons covertly and using its passengers as basically human shields. The Germans knew that this was happening. They publicly announced that if they saw the Lusitania, they would sink it, and they did. And then the newspapers at the time reported that the Germans sunk an innocent civilian ocean liner that was not involved in the war at all. And this impacted public opinion. It made Germany less popular in the minds of most Americans, but it was built on a lie. The newspapers never revealed that the Lusitania was carrying weapons that would be used against the German army. But America's entry into World War I honestly deserves its own lecture, and when we get into Module 2 of our World History series, which is the dedicated module to World War I, they will get their own lecture. But since we're not there yet and we're discussing Woodrow Wilson, we'll leave this to be elaborated on in a future lecture. So if we go on to the next slide. The full scope of the Lusitania, the Zimmerman telegram, and America's involvement will be examined in Module 2 of this World History course. For this lecture, however, let us focus on Wilson's democratic imperialism. Wilson sold the war not as a bailout of Wall Street and J.P. Morgan, but rather as the U.S. making the world safe for democracy. In order to save democracy, according to Wilson, the U.S. needed to militarily intervene in Europe's war and break the European monarchies of Austria-Hungary and Germany. In the wake of these empires' collapses, Wilson desired the creation of self-determining ethno-states in places like Poland, Bohemia, and Silesia. Although Wilson ran on isolationism and keeping America out of the war, he reneged on this promise to the American people. So Wilson had this idea of spreading democracy through imperialism. Does that sound familiar today? You're seeing the roots of where that came from in the Wilson presidency. And Wilson also had this idea of self-determination for every ethnicity. He wanted the Poles to have a Polish state, he wanted the Czechs to have a Czech state, and he didn't like the Kaiserreich in the Austro-Hungarian Empire because they were imperial. However, even though he didn't like the Germans or the Austro-Hungarians, he wanted to keep America out of the war. But, as we all know, when Wall Street called, he would cuck on this promise, and he would bring America into the war. And he would use the war as a way to make the world safe for democracy in his view. So, if we go on to the next slide. The Espionage and Sedition Acts. Although Wilson entered the war on the side of the Allies, or the Entente, a sizable portion of the country was ethnically German and opposed war against the Kaiserreich. These Americans supported the Central Powers, while many other Americans were simply isolationists who wanted to keep out of Europe's bloody war. As a response, the Wilson administration greenlit the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 1918. The Espionage Act, which was in 1917, made it illegal for a U.S. citizen to convey information that would interfere with the military effort, obstruct recruitment, or incite mutiny. And the Sedition Act of 1918 expanded on restrictions in the Espionage Act and criminalized speech that was disloyal, profane, abusive, or seditious towards the U.S. government, the military, or the American flag. So, these two acts in particular are limits on free speech, but they would be used as justification for the internment of several thousand German Americans during the war, which I think is on the next slide if we go to the next slide. Yes, it is. The Espionage and Sedition Acts were applied loosely and coupled with widespread anti-Germanism resulted in the arrest and internment of several thousand German Americans. The Germans would be interned in camps, with two of the most notable being located in Oglethorpe, Georgia, and Hot Springs, North Carolina. This practice would set legal precedent for even more widespread internment of German Americans under the FDR administration in World War II, as well as the more famous internment of Japanese Americans by the FDR regime. So, during World War I, there was widespread hatred of Germans in America. The German culture was suppressed. Ethnic Germans who were here had severe limits placed on them because they could go to jail under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And in some states, the German language was even banned from being taught in public schools. So, these Espionage and Sedition Acts would result in the imprisonment of Germans, but they would also set a legal precedent for German Americans to be interned in World War II, as well as for Japanese Americans. Now, your history teachers in high school will talk all day about the internment of Japanese Americans because they are not white, and they will completely ignore the fact that German Americans were also put in internment camps by FDR during World War II. That's just an example of anti-whiteism by leftist teachers. So, the three pictures here we can see. On the left, there is a New York City police officer fingerprinting a German in 1917. Several Germans in an internment camp at Fort Douglas during World War I. And then on the right, we have a propaganda poster. It's a very famous poster. It depicts Germany as an ape with a pickelhaube on its head, carrying away a woman in distress, and it says, "Destroy this mad brute. Enlist." This is an example of American propaganda. I will probably do a lecture on World War I propaganda on its own right once we get to Module 2. This propaganda poster really encapsulates the anti-German sentiment that was present at the time, and it was used to enlist people into the military. So, if we go on to the next slide. The 18th and 19th Amendments. So we're skipping over Wilson's involvement in the Treaty of Versailles, his 14 points, and the creation of the League of Nations, because these deserve a future lecture in Module 2. All three of these things are important topics, and they deserve a lecture in their own right. And to reiterate, Module 2 is our World War I module, and they really belong there, more so than they do in this lecture. So we will revisit those at a future time. And discussing the 18th and 19th Amendments, the U.S. President does not play a role in the ratification of constitutional amendments. However, since these amendments occurred during Wilson's term in the Oval Office, they must be addressed here. The 18th Amendment was ratified on January 16, 1919, and it prohibited the sale and manufacturing of alcohol. And moving on to the 19th Amendment, on August 18, 1920, Congress ratified the 19th Amendment, which grants women the right to vote. Wilson opposed the 18th Amendment but supported the 19th. And again, it's important to point out that Wilson had no formal control over these since they are constitutional amendments, they are not bills that were signed into law. But, for what it's worth, Wilson lent his vocal support to the 19th Amendment, and he opposed the 18th Amendment. However, in the end, both of these amendments would become law. So, if we go on to the next slide, Wilson's stroke in the first de facto female president. On October 2, 1919, while traveling the U.S. trying to drum up support for joining the League of Nations, Wilson suffered an ischemic stroke which left him incapacitated. Wilson had suffered with strokes throughout his life, but in 1919 was rendered unable to perform his presidential duties. Although he was not fit to lead the country after his stroke, Wilson was not removed from office. His wife Edith assumed a de facto role in government and ran the country until 1921. So, it's commonly joked that we have had a female president and her name was Edith Wilson, but the truth of the matter is that Edith Wilson did effectively take over Wilson's role as executive after his stroke. The White House itself says this, and which is why I've included a whitehouse.gov source at the bottom of the screen, which basically explains that Edith Wilson was the second wife of 28th President Woodrow Wilson. She served as First Lady from 1915 to 1921, and after the president suffered a severe stroke, she pre-screened all matters of state, functionally running the executive branch of government for the remainder of Wilson's second term. Now, I'm not saying this was a good thing that she was effectively president, I'm just saying that it happened. So, if we go on to our next slide, we come to our comprehension check. What are the takeaways? Wilson did implement some good policy which the left resents him for, such as segregating the federal government. However, these do not outweigh his bad policies, such as creating the Federal Reserve and entering the U.S. into World War I. 2. Wilson's presidency and ideas of making the world safe for democracy, as well as the unchecked anti-Germanism during his presidency, set the U.S. on a path of subversion, which we'll see play out when we get to World War II. And 3. Subversive actors were in high places within the Wilson administration, and notably these included Brandeis, who was appointed to Supreme Court, Bernard Baruch, who managed the U.S. economy in the War Industries Board during World War I, and then Colonel House, who was not Jewish, but played a pivotal role in getting the U.S. involved in World War I. So our vocabulary to remember: be sure you can define the Federal Reserve System, Birth of a Nation. That was the film Wilson played, which depicts the KKK as vigilante superheroes, if you want to put it like that. Colonel Edward Mandell House, Bernard Baruch, Frankism, Louis Brandeis, the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918, the 18th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, and Edith Wilson. So thank you all for watching this far. I hope you are finding this world history course useful. In the next lecture, we will look at Asia during the turn of the century. We're still in Module 1, we're not quite to World War I yet, and there's a few other topics to cover first. So, I hope you all enjoyed this lecture, and as always, have a good day.